Hello, and welcome to this week's video lecture on the problem of evil. Today, we're going to discuss the... What? What, Carl? No, it's almost Halloween. I thought it'd be nice to kind of dress up. Yeah, it's kind of like a steampunk thing. What do you mean scary? No, it's not scary at all, Carl. It's just steampunk. Scary mask? I'm not wearing a mask. Oh, that's real funny, Carl. Real funny, right? Huh? Yeah, you know what's funny? You basically are a mask. Little freaking puppet. As I was saying before I was so rudely interrupted, today we're going to discuss theodicy in light of process theology. Now, let's take a few seconds to situate ourselves here. Up to this point, all the different theodicies that we've discussed have really had some alignment with the notion of classical theism. They all maintained that God was omnipotent, omniscient, eternal, and perfectly good. In other cases, God is still viewed with these attributes, but God chooses to set them aside for the sake of a genuine relationship with the world. With process theology, we're engaging in a fundamental worldview shift. So it makes sense that we're going to have to explore that worldview a little bit before we get into the actual theodicy. Some of this is going to be a bit complicated, so do your best to stick with me. After we give a basic introduction to process theology, we'll explore again the idea of God and the idea of evil. Then we're going to chart at least one form of process theodicy in light of our categorizing questions with regard to God's responsibility and God's power or ability to prevent evil. After that, we'll explore our diagnostic questions, and finally, we'll end with a brief critical overview of process theodicy.
Let us get started.
I don't care, Carl. It's fun, and I enjoy it. You're a stupid costume. Process philosophy developed out of the thought of the 20th century English philosopher and mathematician Alfred North Whitehead, as well as the American philosopher, also from the 20th century, Charles Hartshorne. Now, to be clear, there's many different variations of process thought, which lead, of course, to many different theodicies within process thought, just as there are many different theodicies in open theism and classical theism, so on and so forth. Our goal here is to focus on the thought of two prominent contemporary process theologians, David Ray Griffin and John Cobb. While there is a lot of variation within process thought, Cobb and Griffin identify some key basic ideas that are pretty consistent across the board. Let's explore these now. First and foremost, process is essential to existence. Everything is in process. Everything, including God. Second, process entails that existence is comprised of a series of events that we call occasions. This is a little different than we tend to think about reality. The basic idea is that every moment of time, things spring into existence and then spring out of existence. This is also true of me. That is, the me of the past is not the exact same as the me of the present, nor is the me of the present the exact same of the me of the future. Each me of each moment is a unique entity that arises into existence and then fades out of existence. And this is true of all entities, whether it be human beings, atoms, quarks, trees, bears, anything. We might then ask, well, how does something persist over time? To answer this question, Cobb and Griffin note that certain series of events have a lot in common. In fact, they have so much in common that we can identify some sameness between event to event. These essentially similar series of events create what Cobb and Griffin call streams of occasions. And you're looking at one right now. I am a stream of occasions. The idea is that the me in the present is so intricately and essentially related to the me's of the past that we are, in some sense, the same. Furthermore, the me of the present is informed by the me's of the past. This happens in two ways. One, the me's of the past create, in some sense, the atmosphere in which the me in the present comes into existence. And two, the me of the present shares the memories of the me's of the past, such that all of those me's of the past are gathered into this one moment. And this moment, this me that exists right now, will give way to the me of the future. And I, this I that exists in this moment, will become a memory for the me of the future. I know that's all really complicated, but the basic idea that I want to share is everything is in process, and process entails things coming into existence and going out of existence, even if they create a stream of occasions. So when I say actual occasions or streams of occasions, that's what I'm referring to in this video. If that's still a little bit confusing, it might be helpful to think of an analogy here. Consider a flip book. In this analogy, each page of the flipbook is an actual occasion, that is, a me that exists. Each page is individual and separate from every other page. The idea here is that pages only exist when they come into motion. When you're using the flipbook, you're turning it and the pages are flipping. However, some pages are stationary. The pages that have already been flipped are stationary, and the pages that have not yet been flipped are stationary. In this sense, they don't exist, since existence in this analogy is equated with movement. The only entities that actually exist are the pages that are in movement. So here's how a flipbook works. One page moves rapidly across your vision, then another page moves rapidly across your vision. Each page that comes into being moves briefly, has a moment of process, and then gives way to another page. However, if you're looking at the flipbook, there is the appearance of a stream of occasions, that is a coherent narrative that seems to move as if it were one single entity. The problem with this analogy, as we're going to see, is that it suggests that the future is set or determined. After all, a flipbook can only happen the way that it's drawn or the way that it's written. Although a few friends of mine have suggested the possibility of a choose-your-own-adventure flipbook, which might work. Setting that aside, it's important to note that for process theology, the future is not determined. It can happen in many, many different ways. We'll get to that. Third, all occasions have subjectivity. It's important that we not mistake subjectivity with consciousness, but merely the ability to experience your own existence. And when process theologians say that all events have subjectivity, they really mean that. Not just humans, but non-human animals, plants, even non-living matter like rocks have a certain level of subjectivity. But we should note that there are various degrees to the richness of this subjectivity, the richness of these experiences. Certainly a rock doesn't experience things as richly as a human being. Still, the notion is that there is subjectivity in the entire cosmos for every entity that exists. Fourth, the goal of all occasions is to experience what process philosophers refer to as enjoyment. Enjoyment means that occasions experience their existence, their moment of being, in a manner that is conducive to their nature and permits flourishing according to that nature. This flourishing is a balance between harmony with all the world around me, including other entities that are trying to enjoy their existence, and intensity, which means the depth to which I experience my own existence in the moment that I exist. Fifth, all reality is interconnected. We can say this in two ways. First, all reality is interconnected because the me that exists right now is essentially interconnected and related to all the me's of the past. In this sense, whatever entity comes into existence owes its being in some sense to the entities that preceded it. Furthermore, the way that individual entities experience their existence is heavily influenced by the entities of the past. Another way that we are interconnected and interdependent is that every entity is essentially related to all other entities that exist alongside of it. And all of those entities, of course, are also influenced by the entities of the past. In this sense, every entity, everywhere, is influenced in a way by all other entities. Everything is interconnected and related, and this is the essential nature of existence. Everything experiences existence this way, as we'll note, even God. Sixth, all occasions have a degree of self-determination. And again, this is where the flipbook analogy breaks down. To say that all entities have a degree of self-determination is to say that when an entity springs into existence, it is influenced by all entities around it, and it is influenced by the entities of the past. However, within the moment of its existence, it can choose how to create and shape the future. It can bring about newness by determining its own path, at least to a certain extent. This means that the me of the present, while influenced by the me's of the past and all the other entities around me, has some say in what comes next. Some notion of free will, some ability to determine the future, what the me of the future will experience when it comes into reality. Again, all creatures, whether human or not, even living or not, have some degree of self-determination, but they do vary in degrees. A human, with its high level of complexity and mental consciousness, has a lot more self-determination than, say, a rock. But all creatures can respond to the influences that impact them. It follows that the future is not determined. It is open depending on the self-determination of each entity that exists in every moment. This leads to the seventh point. The future is in fact open, and it's even open for God. When each entity chooses its path by way of its degree of self-determination, it engages in an act of creation in which it participates in the creation of the future. In other words, the future that comes into existence is going to be dependent upon the decisions that all entities actually make, the self-determining actions actions that they put into motion. It's also important to note that in this framework, the future actually doesn't exist until it becomes the present. Because the future doesn't yet exist, and because the future is determined by the free actions or free decisions of all entities in existence, the future is essentially unknowable, not only to us humans, but also to God. With these thoughts in place, we can begin to understand how process thought will construe God. Let's take a look at a few key concepts. First, process theologians tend to affirm what they call dipolar theism. Essentially, this means that there are two poles in God. One pole is eternal and unchanging, but this pole refers to God's abstract characteristics. For example, God is love. That doesn't change. God is always love. God is in fact omniscient. That doesn't change. God is always omniscient. However, omniscient here means knowing everything that can be known. The other pole of God's existence is constantly in process and constantly changing. This is God's actual experience of reality. God as God exists in relation to everything else that exists. And in this pole of God's nature, God is responsive and therefore changing. For example, God is constantly love, but exactly how God exercises that love will depend upon how other creatures act. Therefore, God's love is always in process in responding to other creatures. God is all-knowing. This doesn't change. But again, God knows everything that can be known. Because the future can be known, as the future becomes the present, God is constantly learning more. In other words, what can be known continues to grow and develop. So God's knowledge also continues to grow and develop. So in one sense, God is unchanging. That is, God is love, God is omniscient, God is responsive. But in another sense, God is constantly in process. God is always loving in new ways in response to creaturely existence. God is always learning new things as the future becomes the present. It follows from this that God's essential existence is characterized by process and change. In other words, unlike other forms of theodicy that rely upon the idea of voluntary kenosis, where God chooses to be related to other creatures, in process theology, God is essentially related, not because God chooses to be, but because that's just the way reality is. And even God is bound to that reality. Second, Cobb and Griffin, along with many other process theologians, reject the idea that God created the world ex nihilo, out of nothing. For Cobb and Griffin, God creates the world out of a pre-existing and co-eternal chaos that has existed alongside God from the beginning. Of course, there is no such thing as the beginning in eternity, but you get the idea. This chaos is envisioned as a somewhat vacuous existence in which entities spring into being, but immediately spring out of being, and there are no streams of occasion. There's no potential, there's no moment of intense enjoyment that's possible in this kind of world. And so God decides to lure this world toward a particular order in which these kinds of more intense experiences of enjoyment are possible. And this, according to process theologians like Cobb and Griffin, is the divine act of creation. Third, God cannot act coercively upon the world, and God cannot know the future exhaustively. Because on the one hand God is love, and on the other hand God is incorporeal, God cannot physically act on the world and coercively bring about certain changes that God wants to bring about. One of the fundamental themes of process theology is love does not coerce. Love might lure, love might guide, but love does not force. Therefore, God does not force God's will upon the world. The act of creation, then, is not God deciding this is how the world's going to be. It's a slow and long process of God luring chaos toward an order that can facilitate intense levels of enjoyment. In other words, God lures the world toward an order in which streams of occasions are possible. And not just any streams of occasions, but complex streams of occasions. Even the idea of conscious streams of occasion, for example, some higher mammals and humans. All of this is at the service of God intensifying enjoyment and creativity in the created order. But recall that each of these entities has a level of self-determination. It follows that the world that God creates is not completely up to God. These creatures co-create the future with God. While God is one influence, one non-coercive influence upon the world, God is not the only influence. Other creatures also influence the world. It follows that the future isn't necessarily exactly what God wants it to be. And again, recall, these creatures don't have self-determination because God chose to set aside God's omnipotence. They have self-determination because that is the very nature of existence. God cannot choose to create a world where God can control everything. And so when God does create, God is bound to certain principles of existence. One such principle is the idea that the capacity for good and the capacity for evil are proportional and linked together. God cannot create a world with the capacity for good that doesn't also have the capacity for evil. For example, the capacity of pleasure corresponds to the capacity for pain. The capacity for enjoyment corresponds to the capacity of disappointment or triviality. God cannot create the world any other way than this. In short, it would be impossible for God to lure a world into existence that had the capacity for good without risking the reality of evil. That doesn't mean that God is completely hands-off in the world. While God cannot control the future, God does work within each individual occasion, that is, each individual entity. God provides each entity with what process theologians call an initial aim. That is, God provides each entity with a direction, not coercively, but by way of lure or guidance. And that initial aim is the maximal enjoyment of that entity. That's what God wants, all these actual occasions to enjoy their existence. However, because these actual occasions have self-determination, they do not have to conform to the initial aim that God provides them. They create their own subjective aim, what they actually do. Oftentimes, these entities can act in ways that does not cohere with God's desire for the world, God's initial aim, and therefore the future happens in a way that's other than how God actually willed it to happen. It follows also that God experiences the future with creatures, alongside of creatures. God can be surprised by it, disappointed by it. What happens next is not up to God. God is not in control in that sense, and God could not be in control in that sense. God is bound relationally to other creatures, and together, God and creatures create the future. Fourth, God is present everywhere in the world. We've already noted that God is present in all actual occasions, providing them by way of lure some initial aim that God desires for them. God is everywhere at all times. God is completely immanent in the created order. It follows from this that when God takes the risk of creating, God is also risking God's own well-being, because God experiences all the joys and all the harms of the world. Every good thing and every bad thing that happens, God experiences alongside of creatures. I trust that it's clear that this concept of God is fairly different than many of the concepts that we've discussed up to this point. So what about the concept of evil? What does that look like for process theologians? Cobb and Griffin follow Whitehead in identifying two fundamental types of evil. The first type of evil is discord, which entails physical pain and mental suffering, the basic harms that we tend to think about when we think about the problem of evil. However, there's another kind of evil that's also important, and that is triviality. Now, discord is intrinsically evil. Anywhere harms happen, whether physical pain or mental anguish, that's evil, that's bad. Triviality is a little bit different. Triviality refers to creatures not experiencing enjoyment to the extent that they could experience enjoyment. There are some forms of triviality that are unnecessary, when the experience of creatures is so banal that there's hardly any enjoyment at all. This kind of triviality is evil. In other words, it's evil when creatures don't experience enjoyment, when either they're robbed of that enjoyment or they don't choose to live up to the potential of their enjoyment. Cobb and Griffin note that the problem of evil tends to focus on discord as evil, not necessarily triviality, but they want to emphasize triviality because it suggests that God is actually combating two different kinds of evil. On the one hand, there's physical pain and there's mental anguish, but on the other hand, there's this notion that lack of enjoyment is also bad. On the one hand, God has to diminish discord, but on the other hand, God has to overcome triviality. And as we'll find, at times, God can't do both simultaneously. It may be that God has to lure the world toward discord in order to overcome triviality. Before moving on, it's important to note that Griffin adds a unique idea to this conversation. Griffin discusses the idea of genuine evil, which he contrasts to, on the one hand, apparent evil, and on the other hand, prima facie evil. Griffin defines a genuine evil as anything, all things considered, without which the world would have been better. So genuine evil isn't really measured by the experience of individuals, but by the experience of all entities in the cosmos as a whole. Again, the whole outweighs the experience of the individual, or the part. Prima facie evil is evil that, at first glance, looks evil. However, it's possible that our initial evaluation of evil is wrong. Why? Well, because evil can either be intrinsic or instrumental. Also, good can be either intrinsic or instrumental. We discovered this already with the theodicies of Hick and Polkinghorne, that evil plays either some necessary role in achieving some good, or evil is the inevitable outcome of a process that is necessary to achieve a particular goal. Either way, evil has some kind of instrumentalism to it. And the idea is that if the good the evil produces outweighs the evil itself, well then it's not a genuine evil, because the world is better on the whole, even though that evil happened. And because that evil happened. Evils that are not genuine evils, then, are apparent evils. That is, evils that appear evil to us, but in the grand scheme of things are actually justified because the good that they produce outweighs the bad. Genuine evil in this sense is kind of similar to the notion of gratuitous evil. Cobb and Griffin both accept that genuine evil actually exists, and in their minds it's this type of evil that theodicies have to really wrestle with. Alright, having now provided a rather strenuous overview of process theology, including the view of God and evil, let's look at our two categorizing questions. First, is God responsible for evil? Cobb and Griffin both say yes. God is responsible for evil. God is responsible for evil because God lures the world into an order in which certain harms, certain discord is inevitable, and maybe even necessary. For example, without the extinction of dinosaurs, you don't have the high level of complexity of mammals such as humans. But also, God lures the world into an order in which genuine evil is possible. That is, it's a risk. So on the one hand, discord is inevitable, and certain forms of triviality are inevitable, but also genuine evil, evil that is so bad that the world would have been better if it had not happened, that is also a possibility, though not an inevitability. However, Cobb and Griffin both maintain that God is not indictable for luring the world in this direction. There are two reasons for this. First, the reason that God lures the world to this particular order is because that's the only way to overcome triviality by creating complex and intense levels of subjectivity and self-determination. For example, human consciousness. Because triviality can be evil and overcoming triviality is important, this good outweighs all the discord that is inevitable as a result of God's creation. Second, God is not indictable for genuine evil because, again, that genuine evil is a necessary risk of the kind of world that can overcome triviality. This world of complexity and beauty and creativity and self-determination. But God is also not indictable because when genuine evils occur, God cannot coercively act upon the world to prevent them or to stop them once they've begun. Now this claim leads to our next categorizing question. Can God prevent evil? Again, for process theologians, the answer is a resounding no, if by prevent we mean coercively prevent. God is everywhere at work in the world, attempting to lure creation toward initial aims that do not cohere with genuine evil. They might cohere with discord in as much as that's necessary to overcome triviality, but they're not genuine evils. God is trying, by way of non-coercive influence, to avoid these kinds of evils, but God cannot coercively prevent them. So we have a God who is responsible for evil, but not indictable for evil, and a God who cannot prevent evils from occurring or from persisting. This idea leads very nicely into our three diagnostic questions. First, what is the origin of evil? Again, for Cobb and Griffin, God lures the world toward an order in which overcoming triviality is possible. This order entails the inevitability and necessity of discord, and it also risks the existence of genuine evil. Evil then originates because it's part of the order that God created, which is necessary to achieve the goals God wants to achieve, or because creatures in their own self-determination have brought about genuine evil. Why then does evil persist? Again, evil persists because God is unable to coercively prevent it. Once God lures the world into existence, God loses control. The world takes on a life of its own. God cannot dictate where the world's going to go next. And God cannot simply will it out of existence. God must work with what the world provides God. But God cannot work with it coercively. Therefore, again, God cannot stop evils from persisting. One more point is important to note with the persistence of evil. While God is unable to coercively stop the persistence of evil, God also continues to lure the world toward discord inasmuch as that is inevitable or necessary to God's project of overcoming triviality. God lures the world toward pain and suffering, these inevitable or necessary features of the world. Cobb captures this idea well when he suggests that in the act of predation, God is actually luring the prey to run away from the predator, but God is luring the predator to hunt and kill the prey. God is luring both in this direction because that is conducive with each creature's nature. That's the initial aim that would be their enjoyment. The prey getting away and living another day, and the predator killing the prey and eating it. It's important to note then that God lures the world in a direction in which individual creatures must lose. Either the prey is going to get away, in which the predator will go hungry, or the predator will kill the prey, in which the prey will suffer and die. The third diagnostic question is probably the one that process theology struggles the most with. Will God eliminate evil? Again, on the one hand, process theologians maintain that God is everywhere and at all times present in creation, luring the world toward goodness, or at least luring the world toward overall goodness, not necessarily the good of each individual creature. And God's lure can lead the world in new directions of beautiful creativity and heightened levels of enjoyment. On the other hand, we have to note that God cannot coercively impact the world. We also have to remember that God can only work with the world that creatures co-create. This world that we live in has had genocides, terrible natural disasters, pandemics, extinctions, so on and so forth. That's the world God has to work with, and God cannot coercively control that world. That means that God cannot guarantee the future that God desires for the world. In other words, God might lose. God might never see the future that God ultimately wants to see. Cobb and Griffin acknowledge this point, that God can't guarantee victory over evil. But they also say that God will continuously work toward victory over evil. But we have to ask then, how likely is that victory, given the limitations that appear to be intrinsic to God's very existence? Let's shift now to our critical analysis of process theodicy. First, what's good about it? Well, first, I think we can agree that process theology presents a somewhat coherent worldview. Classical theism tells us that God is love and gracious and merciful and all of these kinds of things, even compassionate. But it also wants to maintain that God is unchanging and impassible, that is, God can experience passion or emotion. Process theologians argue that this is really nonsensical. How can a God who cannot experience change or cannot experience passion, how can that God love? How can that God feel compassion? But the God of process theology doesn't have that kind of problem. This God is not bound to the unchanging perfection of Hellenistic thought. Second, the scientific notion of interconnectedness and interdependency fits really well in a process worldview. So does the evolutionary narrative, the idea that creation must evolve toward higher degrees of complexity and intensity. In this sense, process theology provides a nice theological framework that can dialogue with science fairly easily. Third, one of the problems with the other theodicies that we've discussed, the ones where God voluntarily sets aside God's power, is that God stands idly by allowing evil to happen when God could theoretically prevent it. Process theology does not have this problem. God does not stand idly by, ever. God is constantly working to the greatest degree that God is capable of doing so to prevent evil and bring about good. God simply can't coercively control the cosmos. And let's be honest, a God who can't coercively control the cosmos seems less indictable for evil than a God who could coercively control the cosmos but chooses not to. So does process theology present us a better theodicy than the other options? Well, not necessarily. There are some valid criticisms of it. Some theologians take issue with process theology because it strays too far from traditional Christianity or traditional theism. John Polkinghorne is one example of this. The idea is this God is too weak to really be called God. I'm not going to focus on this criticism as much because I think there's a better criticism of the theodicy itself. And this brings us back to the question of the plight of individual creatures. Process theology gives us a world that God doesn't create by divine fiat or by coercive manipulation, but God still lures the world toward an order in which discord and certain levels of triviality are inevitable. And we're not just talking about minor discord here. We're talking about disease, predation, natural disasters. All of these things are inevitable aspects of the order that God lured the world toward. It follows that process theology doesn't quite get away from the accusation that God facilitated the existence of a world in which innocent, unwilling creatures would suffer tremendous and disproportionate harms, and that this suffering would be inevitable and even necessary. The short of it is this: God lures the world into an order in which pediatric cancer is inevitable. So let's ask the question, is God's act of creation good news for these victims? Do they really experience God's creative activity as an opportunity for enjoyment, or is it merely full of discord for them? And do their experiences matter? But we can say more. God continues to lure the world in this direction. Let's take the COVID virus, for example. With regard to the COVID virus, this entity that springs into existence, is God luring it to live out its life as a virus? Is God luring it toward its own enjoyment, when its own enjoyment means tremendous suffering for other creatures? It seems that for process theology, the answer is yes, God is luring it in that direction, because that's part and parcel of the order that God creates. That's the cost of overcoming triviality in the long run. In this sense, process theodicy doesn't seem to give us much benefits over other theodicies. However, we've already acknowledged that it does seem stronger in some areas. For instance, the idea that God cannot coercively act upon creation, well, that seems to make God less indictable. So it still might seem that process theodicy is better than the alternatives. But process theodicy faces a unique challenge that other theodicies don't face. Take the theodicies of Hick and Polkinghorne, for example. God does direct the world toward certain evils, certain physical harms, but God also has the power to guarantee an eschatological victory over evil in the long run. In process theology, God lures the world toward these inevitable harms that are going to befall, in a very disproportionate and intense amount, innocent, unwilling individuals. But God cannot guarantee to make the world right for those individuals. God cannot guarantee to redeem them. And as we've noted, it actually seems unlikely that God will be able to. Again, how does a God who cannot prevent pediatric cancer, or who cannot prevent Holocaust, or who cannot coercively prevent one murderer from murdering a child, how does this God give us any confidence in the notion of a universal resurrection in which the creatures who suffered are somehow redeemed from their suffering? In short, it seems that for process theodicy, God lures the world into existence that will inevitably lead to all these harms and all of these victims, when God knows that in all reasonability and all probability, those victims are going to stay in their graves. God won't be able to redeem them. This seems to be a major problem. In sum, process theology provides us a really interesting and unique way of looking at the world. It provides some great benefits with regard to theodicy, but it also still has lots of problems and some unique problems that other theodicies don't have. There may, however, be other ways of envisioning process theodicy that make it more manageable, more palatable. Next week, we're going to explore the theodicy of Tom Ord, who attempts just such a thing. Until then, I bid you all farewell.
Is this too much, Carl? I kind of feel like it's a little bit too much.